"Are you deaf, lady?" I said. "Move it." The voice, sharp and serrated, cut through the quiet hum of the barracks. Dakota Rains didn't flinch. At 38, she'd learned that the loudest noises were often the least threatening. She continued her work, guiding the wet mop in slow, overlapping arcs, the scent of bleach and pine rising from the freshly cleaned linoleum. The floor gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a perfect mirror of the ceiling above. The voice belonged to Petty Officer Thorne, a man carved from granite and impatience. He stood with two other SEAL candidates, all of them radiating the restless, predatory energy of caged lions. They were young, their muscles coiled like springs under their tight t-shirts, their faces still holding the arrogant certainty that the world was something to be conquered, not endured. She was back in the smoke and chaos of that forgotten compound. Her teammate, a fierce sergeant named Carmen, was dying in her arms. The battle was over, the silence deafening. Carmen, with her last breath, had pressed the small piece of brass into Dakota's hand. It was the pin from the grenade that had saved them during the first assault. "Don't let them forget us, Coda," Carmen had whispered, her eyes already losing focus. "Don't let them forget this place." Dakota had closed her hand around it, the metal still warm, and had made a silent promise. The fallout was swift and decisive. Petty Officer Thorne was not kicked out of the SEAL program. Admiral Pace, in a moment of wisdom, decided that would be too easy. Instead, Thorne was recycled. He was sent back to day one, week one of Bud/S, forced to start the entire grueling 6-month ordeal all over again. It was a profound humiliation, a public declaration of his failure not of body but of character. He would have to earn his way back, inch by painful inch, under the watchful eyes of instructors who now knew his story. For the institution, the change was more significant. Admiral Pace mandated a new addition to the Bud/curriculum, a non-negotiable history course taught by Master Chief McIntyre himself, focusing on the origins of naval special warfare and its roots in the shadowy operations of joint task forces. The first lecture was titled simply, "The Legacy of Dakota Rains." An oversized framed photograph of Staff Sergeant Dakota Rains in combat gear was hung in the main hall of the training center, a permanent reminder to every candidate of the history they were inheriting. The base offered Dakota a formal apology and a quiet pension increase, which she politely accepted, but she didn't quit her job. The next day, she was back in the barracks with her mop and bucket, the floors gleaming under her slow, steady care. Her presence, however, had changed. She was no longer an invisible woman. The trainees spoke to her with quiet, reverent respect. They held doors for her. They asked if she needed anything. They saw her not as a janitor, but as a living monument. Weeks later, a much-changed Thorne, now a lowly trainee again, gaunt and humbled from the brutal re-immersion into Hell Week, saw Dakota sitting alone in the mess hall, slowly eating her lunch. After a long moment of hesitation, Thorne picked up his tray, walked over, and stood before her table. Dakota looked up, her dark eyes questioning. Thorne swallowed hard, the arrogance long since scoured out of him. "Miss Rains," he said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "Ma'am, could you tell me about Carmen?" Dakota looked at the young man for a long time. She saw the shame in his eyes, but also a flicker of genuine curiosity, a desire to understand. She gave a slow nod and gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Sit down, son," Dakota Rains said. "Let me tell you about a real hero." If you were moved by Dakota's story, please like this video, share it with someone who respects our veterans, and subscribe to Veterans Past Stories for more tales of unassuming heroes. Back in the barracks, Thorne was pushing his advantage to its breaking point. Dakota's silence was infuriating him, making him feel oddly powerless. Despite his physical dominance, he needed to provoke a reaction to make her crack. "That's it. I'm done with this," Thorne declared, puffing out his chest. He reached out and grabbed Dakota's thin arm. The muscle beneath the loose fabric of the coveralls was surprisingly hard, like coiled steel. "You're coming with me. We're going to have a nice long chat with base security. Maybe they can figure out what a civilian like you is doing here." He started to pull Dakota toward the main door. It was the ultimate act of hubris, the final step over a line he didn't even know existed. The other trainees shuffled their feet, a few of them now looking deeply uncomfortable. This had gone from simple hazing to something much uglier. But Dakota did not move. Thorne pulled, but the woman was an anchor, her worn boots seemingly fused to the linoleum. For the first time, a flicker of something other than calm appeared in Dakota's eyes. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, ancient weariness, the look of someone who had seen humanity at its absolute worst and was disappointed but not surprised to be seeing it again. Just as Thorne was about to give a more violent tug, a sound from outside cut through the tension. It started as a low rumble and grew rapidly into the squeal of tires on asphalt. It wasn't the sound of a single MP Jeep. It was the sound of a convoy. Heads turned. Through the large windows of the barracks, they saw a sight that made no sense. Two black SUVs with government plates and small flags mounted on their front fenders screeched to a halt, flanked by two Marine Patrol vehicles, their lights flashing. Doors flew open. The base commander, a captain known for his stern demeanor, practically fell out of the lead SUV, his face ashen. He was followed by a detail of armed Marines in their dress blues, who immediately formed a security perimeter. And then from the rear door of the second SUV, Rear Admiral Franklin Pace emerged. He was the commander of all Navy SEALs, a two-star admiral, a man whose face was known only from official photographs and base-wide addresses. He was a creature of headquarters and high-level strategy, not the gritty reality of the Bud/Barracks. His presence here was as shocking as a lightning strike on a clear day. The barracks door flew open with a crash. The base commander rushed in, his eyes wide with panic. He saw the scene, the star trainee holding the civilian janitor by the arm, and a look of pure horror crossed his face. Thorne, utterly bewildered, dropped Dakota's arm as if it were red hot. He and every other man in the room snapped to attention, their backs ramrod straight, their eyes locked forward. Admiral Pace strode into the barracks, his presence sucking all the air out of the room. He was followed by Master Chief McIntyre, who stood grimly by the door. The Admiral's eyes, cold and furious, swept over the terrified trainees, over the panicked base commander, and finally landed on Thorne. He looked at the young, powerful SEAL candidate as if he were a piece of dirt on his shoe. But he didn't speak to him. Instead, he walked past Thorne, past everyone, and came to a stop directly in front of the woman in the navy blue coveralls. Dakota Rains simply watched him approach, her expression unchanged. The room was utterly silent. The only sound was the distant hum of the SUV engines and the frantic beating of 24 hearts. Then the impossible happened. Rear Admiral Franklin Pace, commander of the most elite fighting force in the world, brought his heels together with a sharp click on the linoleum floor. He raised his hand to his brow in a salute so crisp, so perfect, it seemed to cut the air. "Miss Rains," the Admiral's voice boomed, filled with a respect that bordered on reverence. "It is an honor, ma'am." Thorne's jaw went slack. The other trainees stared in stunned disbelief. They were witnessing a break in the fundamental laws of their universe. A two-star admiral was saluting a janitor. Dakota slowly, almost tiredly, raised a hand and gave a slight nod. It was not a return of the salute, but an acknowledgement, an acceptance. The admiral held his salute for a long moment before dropping his hand. He then turned to face the assembled SEAL candidates, his gaze sweeping over their shocked faces until it locked onto Thorne. "Do you have any idea who this is?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Thorne, pale and trembling, could only shake his head. "No, sir," the admiral continued, his voice rising with controlled fury. "You don't. You see a woman, a janitor, someone in your way. You are training to be the tip of the spear, but you have no concept of the history of the steel that forged it." He gestured toward Dakota. "This is Dakota Rains. In 2007, she was a staff sergeant in a Joint Special Operations Task Force, attached to one of the most classified counterterrorism units operating in Iraq and Afghanistan." A murmur went through the room. "This woman," the admiral said, his voice now ringing with terrible clarity, "was part of a 4-person team that was inserted into a compound in Helmand province to capture a high-value target. They were compromised and surrounded by over 200 Taliban fighters." The admiral took a step toward Thorne, who looked as if he might faint. For 14 hours they held that position. Dakota Rains, armed with a rifle in her sidearm, personally repelled wave after wave of assault. When her team leader was hit, she took command. When their communications specialist was killed, she held the enemy off with one hand while calling in close air support with the other, directing fire so close she was burned by the blasts. He pointed a finger at Thorne's chest. When they ran out of ammunition, she used her knife in her bare hands. By the time reinforcements arrived, only Dakota and one other operator were still alive, surrounded by the bodies of over 70 enemy combatants. The admiral's voice dropped to a deadly calm. "The tactics you are learning in this program, the small unit strategies, the very concept of unconventional warfare that you think is so modern, people like Dakota Rains wrote that book. They wrote it in blood, in the dirt, in places you've only read about. The admiral then turned his gaze to the small tarnished pin on Dakota's collar. For her actions in that compound, she was awarded the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest award for valor. He paused, letting that sink in. This pin, he said, his voice softening with awe, is not from the janitorial department. It is a piece of the first grenade pin she ever pulled in combat, a reminder. The silence in the room was now absolute, heavy with shame and awe. Every eye was on Dakota, who looked not like a hero, but like someone profoundly tired, someone who had carried the weight of that compound for more than 15 years. Then the admiral delivered the final, crushing blow. He turned back to the petrified Thorn. "Petty officer," he commanded, his voice like ice, "unsling your weapon." Thorn fumbled with his M4 rifle, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the clasp. He held the weapon out. "Hand it to Miss Rains." Thorn obeyed, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. He stepped forward and presented the rifle to the woman in coveralls. The moment Dakota's hands touched the modern polymer and steel weapon, a transformation occurred. It was subtle but total. The weary slump in her shoulders vanished. Her back straightened. The 38-year-old janitor disappeared, and in her place stood an operator. Her hands, which had moved slowly with the mop, were now rock steady. They moved with an innate, terrifying familiarity over the rifle's controls. Her grip was perfect, her trigger discipline flawless. She brought the weapon up to her shoulder in a single fluid motion, her eye aligning perfectly with the sight. She checked the magazine, worked the charging handle, and scanned the room, her gaze sweeping over the trainees with an intensity that made them feel like targets. She did it all in less than 2 seconds. It was a display of economy and purpose that no amount of training could replicate. It was instinct. It was mastery. She held the pose for a heartbeat, a silent, powerful lesson for every man in the room. Then, with the same fluid efficiency, she made the weapon safe, ejected the magazine, and handed it back to a ghostly white Thorn. The admiral let the lesson sink in before he spoke again, his voice a low growl directed at Thorn. "You stand on the shoulders of giants, petty officer, and today you were spitting on the woman who built the very foundation you stand on. You are a disgrace to that uniform and to the memory of every operator who came before you." He then turned to Dakota, his expression softening completely. "Ms. Rains, Dakota, is there anything we can do for you?" Dakota looked at the admiral, at the terrified young men, at the mop and bucket sitting in a puddle on the floor. She gave a small, sad smile. "The uniform changes, Admiral," she said, her voice filling the silent room. "The job doesn't. Respect isn't in the rank. It's in the work. It's earned every day." She gestured to the barracks, "In here," and then she looked at Thorn, not with anger but with a hint of pity. "He's just young. He hasn't learned yet that the toughest enemy is the one you see in the mirror every morning." As she spoke of earning respect, a final, clear image bloomed in Dakota's mind. The air crackled with tension. Dakota simply stood her ground, her dark eyes fixed on Thorn, her expression unreadable. Master Chief McIntyre had seen enough. He didn't step forward. He didn't shout. That would only give Thorn the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he quietly uncrossed his arms, pulled his phone from his pocket, and turned away, melting back into the shadows of the doorway. He scrolled through his contacts, past names labeled OPS, Armory, and Rangemaster, until he found the one he was looking for. He pressed the call button and lifted the phone to his ear. The audience in the barracks was now convinced they were about to see a woman arrested, or at least hauled off for questioning. They were about to witness the peak of Thorn's dominance. They and Thorn himself had no idea that help was already on the way. They didn't know that Master Chief McIntyre's call wasn't going to the military police on base. It was going to a number he hadn't dialed in over 5 years. A direct line. "Sir," Mac said, his voice low and urgent, keeping it out of earshot of the drama in the hall. "It's McIntyre. Sorry to bother you, but you're not going to believe this. I'm at the Bud/Barracks, and I think I'm looking at Dakota Rains." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Yes, sir," Mac continued, his eyes glancing back at the scene. "The Dakota Rains? She's cleaning the floor." The response on the other end of the line was immediate and explosive. Mac listened for a moment, his expression grim. "Yes, sir. Petty Officer Thorn. He's got her cornered now. I think you need to get here fast." He ended the call, a sense of grim certainty settling over him. The cavalry was coming, and Thorn was about to learn a lesson that no amount of surf torture or log PT could ever teach him. Inside a sprawling mahogany-paneled office at Naval Special Warfare Command Headquarters, 12 miles away, Rear Admiral Franklin Pace slammed his phone down into its cradle. The polished wood vibrated from the impact. His aide, a young, crisp lieutenant, jumped in his chair. "Sir." Admiral Pace stood up, his face a thundercloud. He was a man known for his icy calm, a commander who had navigated complex global operations from the quiet of his command center without ever raising his voice. That calm had just been shattered. "Get my car," he barked, striding toward the door and grabbing his cover from its stand. "Now, and get the base commander on the line. Tell him to meet me at the Bud/Barracks Bravo Company, 5 minutes ago. Tell him we have a Code L event." The lieutenant, pale-faced, fumbled with his phone. He had never heard of a Code L. It wasn't in any of the manuals. "Sir, what is a Code L?" Admiral Pace paused at the door, turning back to fix the young officer with a stare that felt like it could strip paint. LEL stands for Legend. It means a living Medal of Honor or Distinguished Service Cross recipient is on this base, unescorted and unrecognized. He paused. "In this case, it means one of the greatest warriors this nation has ever produced is on our soil, and one of our people is apparently spitting in her face. Move." The lieutenant scrambled into action, his hands flying across his phone as the admiral swept out of the office. The entire command staff was jolted into a state of high alert. A Code L. No one knew what it meant, but they knew the admiral's tone. It was the sound of a world about to be turned upside down. "Dakota Rains." "Well, Dakota Rains, your picture looks like a DMV reject." He didn't return the card. Instead, his eyes drifted down to the collar of Dakota's coveralls. Pinned there was a small, tarnished piece of brass. It was nondescript, barely larger than a thumbnail, with no discernible markings. From a distance, it looked like a piece of junk, something found in a drawer and pinned on for no reason. Thorne reached out and flicked it with his finger. "What's this? Your Employee of the Month award from the janitorial department?" The moment his finger touched the metal, the world shifted for Dakota. It wasn't a memory, not a full one. It was a flash of sensations, a ghost of a life lived years ago. The suffocating dry heat of an Iraqi compound. The metallic tang of blood in her mouth. The rhythmic thumping of helicopter blades cutting through smoke-filled air. The oppressive weight of a teammate's body draped over her shoulder. The whisper of a dying woman's last words against her ear. The glint of that same piece of brass, not tarnished then but new and gleaming, pressed into her palm by a hand that was already growing cold. It was over in a second, a phantom limb of a past she never spoke of. She blinked. The fluorescent lights of the barracks returned. Bright and sterile, she was just a woman leaning on a mop. From a doorway across the hall, Master Chief McIntyre watched the scene unfold. His arms crossed over his chest. Mac was a living legend in the teams, a man who had been through the hell of Bud/ before Thorne was even born. He had a face like a roadmap of every war zone from the last 30 years, and eyes that missed nothing. He had seen Thorne's type before, strong, capable, but with an arrogance that was a liability, a cancer in a unit. But it wasn't Thorne's bullying that held Mac's attention. It was the janitor. He saw the woman's stillness, the utter lack of fear or indignation. It was a profound, unsettling calm, the kind Mac had only ever seen in operators who had walked through the very worst of the fire and come out the other side, made of something other than flesh and bone. He watched as Thorne flicked the pin on her collar. Mac squinted, his eyes sharp. He couldn't make out the pin clearly, but he recognized the woman's posture. It was the posture of someone who was so fundamentally dangerous that she no longer had any need to prove it. Thorne, meanwhile, was enjoying his performance. He held Dakota's ID hostage, dangling it between his thumb and forefinger. The crowd of trainees had grown. No one intervened. This was Thorne's show. "I'm thinking this ID might be fake," Thorne said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think we need to have the MPs sort this out. A civilian your age, your condition." He looked her up and down with obvious disdain. "You could be a security risk." He took another step, invading Dakota's personal space, using his physical size to loom and intimidate. "I've got a gear inspection in 10, and you're polishing the floor like it's the crown jewels," Thorne snapped, taking a step closer. His boots, spotless and black, stopped just shy of the wet floor, a small island of defiance in Dakota's sea of clean. "This is a barracks, not a spa. Get your bucket and go." Dakota finished her arc, her movements unhurried, economical. She straightened her back, a slow process that seemed to annoy Thorne even further. Her eyes, dark brown and calm, met the petty officers. They were observant, steady, and held a depth that Thorne mistook for submissiveness. "Almost done," Dakota said, her voice low and even. It wasn't defiant, merely factual. I don't care if you're almost done, Thorne sneered. The other two candidates chuckled, a low rumble of pack animal amusement. I'm the guy telling you to get out of the way, now. The confrontation had drawn a small audience. A few other trainees fresh from their morning run lingered by their bunks, pretending to sort their gear while their eyes flickered toward the scene unfolding in the central corridor. This was Thorne's domain, and the woman with the mop had trespassed on his authority. Thorne was a star in the brutal constellation of basic underwater demolition/SEAL training. He was faster, stronger, and meaner than almost anyone else in his class. He thrived on the pain, on the instructors screaming, on the frigid shock of the Pacific. He saw the world as a hierarchy of strength, and the quiet woman with the mop was at the absolute bottom, an obstacle, a ghost who haunted the edges of their elite world, smelling of disinfectant and irrelevance. You know, Thorne said, circling Dakota slowly, I don't think you should be in here at all. This is a secure area. We have mission-critical equipment, training protocols. What's to stop some civilian cleaning lady from, I don't know, listening in? Poking around? Dakota leaned on her mop, her lean hands resting on the worn wooden handle. I have a clearance, they checked. They checked, Thorne scoffed, stopping directly in front of Dakota, forcing her to look up at him. You look like you should be folding towels at a gym. Let me see some ID. The demand hung in the air, a deliberate escalation. A janitor didn't get asked for ID by a trainee. It was a power play, a public humiliation. Dakota's gaze didn't waver. She simply reached into the pocket of her navy blue coveralls and pulled out a worn vinyl card holder. Her movements were steady, betraying no anger or fear. She was an island of calm in a sea of simmering testosterone. She pulled out her base access identification card and held it out. Thorne snatched it from her hand. He glanced at it, then back at Dakota, a smirk playing on his lips.